So full disclosure, no intros needed. I think it's on the website. My first AI presentation. I had tons and tons of data. And I said, you know what, I need to evolve. And I used AI, developed it, and I would love to hear some feedback. It is still proprietary to me, nonetheless. So good evening, thank you for taking the time. And I'm excited to tell you 2025 is the beginning of where we're going to start to talk about CISOs evolving and changing. To start off with, the topic is risk management leaders. We heard a little bit from Tim Coates as well as Tim Brown. If you work for companies that are publicly traded, more than likely they know of their peers or some others that are getting breached, and they're all starting to worry about this topic. The topic is understanding the 3 lines of defense. Risk management, second-line defense has become a topic at a lot of boards, including ones I've been in, primarily because if you're publicly traded, you need to start managing risk in a different way. The regulators are paying attention. They're asking the questions. Are you solving world hunger to the CISO? That's the question they're asking the CISOs. CISOs are not going to do that. The CISOs are not fixing every problem. As first-line defenders, they're focused on day-to-day defense, right? So I want to introduce you to this topic in 15 minutes, and I'll turn it over to Daniel. To begin to really ask the question is, what do we need to do to begin to have a better conversation across the organization, particularly to the board, so that the right information is being used when it comes to governance. So as I dive into, by quick show of hands, how many of you work in the regulated world today? Excellent. So about a third of you. So going into the 3-line defense framework, it starts with, at the top, you've got the board. Most companies pretty much have a board. The role of the board is very specific, truly governance. However, you do have the first-line defense. CISOs are first-line defenders. They own policies and standards. They're responsible for security posture of the company, et cetera, et cetera. You do it day in and day out. And you may have a little bit of a compliance. There may be some risk visibility to tracking because you have to respond to, if you're selling product, to a customer that's asking questions about particular risk, whether HIPAA compliance, whatever it may be. So there may be a little bit of compliance. Sometimes it sits with the CISO, sometimes it sits with the CFO, but there may be a compliance function. But when it comes to true second line, it doesn't exist in most publicly traded companies today. But they are beginning to talk about that. The line that you see in red as second-line defenders, there is a clear distinction between what is really a compliance function versus risk management. When I spent 23 years in a bank, there was a heavy risk management focus, larger than the entire CISO function, because you have to manage risk. You have to have the right visibility into what matters for the business to operate, and set the right tone from frameworks required, and setting the right tone for the compliance teams to ensure that the controls are being designed correctly. So they own the design of the framework and the controls that are required for the company to operate in. What we fail most of the time as CISOs is to translate the language of what we see from vulnerabilities to truly risk data, to posture information, to material impact to the business outcomes, whether it's an impact to operational, reputational, financial, legal, to the board. The board members, majority of them, don't understand what CVSS 10 means, and they really shouldn't. I should never report that type of data to the board. However, I should be translating that information to tell them this CVSS score has an impact to all these 3 or 4 areas, and it means X, Y, and Z from a dollar impact. They get that, right? So the role is truly for the risk management function to define that criteria. And if you're regulated, you do have some of that already defined. If you're not regulated, you really don't. So as CISOs, our evolution is to begin to actually put together visibility into what risks really means, help the organization develop a framework, and begin to translate all of our security information into a business language. How do you begin to do that? Well, first, know your board. Are there techie boards? Probably not. Most of them are, ex-accountants, business leaders, CEOs. They don't really understand your world. However, they do understand risk to some level, from risk appetite, whether it's making decisions around compliance needs, direction of the company, which is another reason I think a lot of us as CISOs, security leaders, don't spend that much time with the board, and we shouldn't. There may be a committee, a subset committee from the audit committee that you sit with quarterly. And again, their role is to translate your information. There may be one of them that has more technology or risk background and explain that to the rest of the board that meets every month, for example, right? Our ability to begin to have that, break that barrier and go straight to the board, give them material data that they can make these decisions will be the key for us to be successful down the line. So that's the first level board organization. Process control owners, CISOs, and first line defenders, what you see in the back is what you do. I don't have to tell you this, you do this all the time. You own the policies, et cetera. You do the risk assessments, you report to the compliance team, you have to make sure you have SOC 2, et cetera, et cetera. You're truly just a first line defender. That's your role. Compliance is that I mentioned, not all organizations have a distinct compliance function, but truly they're making interpretations of rules of the road. If you're saying you're going to follow NIST, they'll make sure that those controls are embedded. The IT team has the processes, et cetera. That's what compliance does, but they don't do risk. They don't really develop risk management frameworks either. The risk function, that's what they're supposed to do. If you're in a risk organization, this is the team that actually gets you out of jail by defining the risk appetite, by defining and telling you the direction of the company in terms of controls that it expects to put in place and what the escalation process is, et cetera. All right? The key responsibilities for second line defense is to give you an assurance from a control perspective before you get audited that you're actually following the chain of command when it comes to designing the framework, but also what are the right ways of actually measuring that so that you can define and explain to the board whether you are within the appetite or outside the appetite, if you're creating a risk appetite, for example, and also provide you a guidance around how you report the issues. Because your issue, maybe you may see it as a cyber risk, a cyber issue, but it's actually maybe impacting production more than anything. So your data should help translate that production outage from a risk standpoint. So when we were at Citibank, for example, vulnerability information was reported as defects. And we were doing the defect management and defect density because we married that with the technology defect issues to help the business make decision whether they are going to actually fix this issue or not. It wasn't because it was vulnerability. It was a defect that had a material impact for the business, an outage, from a continuity, et cetera. That's the language that they understood. It also helped us get the budget that we needed to actually fix the problem. The risk management also has the regulatory visibility requirements as well. They will help you define the types of, whether it's financial, budget, but also from a design perspective, how you structure your teams, and look at the regulatory track. If you're regulated and if you're global, they'll help you with the rest of it in terms of bringing that together so that you're also able to put together a good track on building that from a process perspective. The threat assessment that you do should be designed through the risk management function as well. You're not going to learn everything about risk management today in a 15-minute talk, but I want to open up the conversation so we're all aligned on the same topic. Internal audit in non-regulated world, they are truly acting as a pseudo-risk function and sitting with the board every month, providing status on closures of gaps, et cetera. That's typically who you interact with. In regulated world, it's completely different. They're providing assurance. They sit distinctly different. I see the board more engaged with risk management in regulated world than audit. The focus has been changing significantly. As Garrie said, AI is here to stay. Yes, it is here to stay, but the regulators are also going to be coming up with new regulations around that as well. There is a lot of different regulations that are coming out that we all have to adhere to. Even if you're not a publicly traded company, you probably are selling or providing services for others that are publicly traded that do have to worry about this. So you also need to start to think about that. So with that, high-level kind of a roadmap, next steps. As you think about yourself as security leaders and now beginning to think about how do I do risk, how do I have the right conversation with the leadership, the company may not necessarily want to build a risk management function, but you should begin to think about how you can translate your data into a language that's more about business outcome for the senior leadership on the board, and also focusing on design from a secure perspective, resilience, prepare for certain types of regulatory scrutiny, even if you're not publicly traded. If you do have a bad day, you get breached, you will have somebody breathing down your neck, depending on who your majority customers are. And take some key action plans, like prioritize, right? You can't fix, well, you know, you're not going to solve world hunger, but think about kind of prioritizing from a risk perspective what's important to you. And then the bigger question is coming up next with the Daniel, so I'll turn that over to you.
So cybersecurity insurance, I know it's super exciting. But I don't want everybody to sit at the edge of their seat at once. But at a practical level, cybersecurity insurance, so there's this whole conversation. And I was talking with Tim Brown. My background, I'm faculty at Harvard. I built a bunch of tech companies, hold a law degree, worked at the Supreme Court, blah, blah, blah. Now, since we only have 15 minutes, we'll just be fairly succinct. Cybersecurity insurance comes in two forms. Let me talk about the most important one. If you feel you work at a company where you need personal cybersecurity insurance because they're going to hang you out to dry, quit and find a new job. Okay, I can't be more direct than that. You don't want to work at a place where you feel that you need to have personal cybersecurity insurance. First off, you won't get enough to even remotely cover what it will cost. Right? You can ask Tim Brown. He blew $1 million before pre-Wells. That was just for his defense. Post-Wells, probably 5 to 10 million just in his defense. You won't get personal cybersecurity insurance that even broaches $10 million, and certainly not at a price point you're willing to pay. But more importantly, do you really want to work at an employer who's like, yeah, I'm going to leave you out to dry. Don't worry about it. Good luck. Right? Probably not. My advice is, maybe you like working in a place like that. My advice to you is I would find a different job and look to work somewhere else if the culture is like that. The second kind of cybersecurity insurance is what we call corporate cybersecurity insurance, and that's managing the risk of the company on a data breach and the other things. Now, I won't get into the boringness of the cybersecurity insurance policy because I was talking with Tim and he told me something really important. He told me that there's CISOs that are going to the board saying, I want to see the D&O policy. Newsflash, nobody likes to be bossed around. So if you want to actually have a conversation, right, you need to go to the CFO and say, hey, look, my colleague here, Tim Brown, he just was personally on the hook. They spent millions of dollars on his defense. I love working here, but I don't have $5 million to cover my personal risk here. How can we help manage that? Now, that's different than what cybersecurity insurance is. Cybersecurity insurance is a corporate product used to secure an enterprise, first line and third line, and these other risks, okay? So let's talk about what you need to do as a chief security officer to manage your own risk. Right? So first off, you have to have a conversation, okay? Don't tell them, I demand to see it. Because A, you don't even know what you're looking at, let's be honest. Like, they give you the D&O policy, it'll be like, you know, good 50 to 60 pages in insurance speak. And you'll look at it and put it through ChatGPT and they'll be like, blah, 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 blah. And you'll be like, awesome. And you'll be left with nothing that you can actually use. So what do you need? Right? So what you need is to have an employment contract or an agreement with them in writing that says, hey, look, if there's a breach while I'm employed or post-employment, you agree to reimburse me. You cover my costs. You pay for my lawyer defense. You indemnify me, right? These are things you put in your employment contract. Now, if you are, so not all CISOs are created the same. Sorry, break the bad news. There's some that are big bosses and some are want to be big bosses, but their company says no. and you sit at the bottom and you don't have what we call D&O and E&O and all of these different kinds of corporate level of insurances, right? So if you're a senior C-level executive, you probably have a D&O that's directors and officer policy, part of the chosen people. Get it? Chosen? No. Okay, so you get chosen, or you have an E&O, errors and omissions policy, or a general liability policy, and those will all be policies that will cover you as a senior executive. But if you're not that senior executive, right, that doesn't mean that you can't get coverage, that you won't be covered, but you have to have a conversation. What you can't do is say, I need to see the D&O policy. I need to make sure I'm covered. A, you don't even know what that means. And B, even if you do have coverage, you don't know how it'll trigger. So what you need to do is go to them and have a conversation and then say, hey, look, you know, it would be very helpful and effective if you could hire for me outside independent counsel that can look at the D&O policy and tell me that I have coverage, right? And you have a conversation. And then you can modify your employment contract. That is much different than personal cybersecurity insurance. Personal cybersecurity insurance, now look, if you're a virtual CISO, yes, you should have a lot of cybersecurity insurance because you will get sued, and repeatedly, because you are providing a service to companies. And when your service results in a hack or whatever else, the plaintiff's lawyers in the United States sue everybody, and they will certainly sue you, okay? But that's if you're providing a service. So if you're providing a service, you probably want to have cybersecurity insurance for your company, for yourself, at a personal level. But if you're a CISO and you're worried about the company hanging you out to dry to pay your legal bills, you need to get a different job. Because to be very blunt about it, like the defense that Tim Brown received probably ran just for him, just him, $7 to $9 million. That's a big check to write. Right? And I don't think any corporation that has a senior cyber executive is expecting them to write that check. But you have to have a conversation and guide that conversation. You need to, you know, look, I'm an attorney, I'm a partner at a law firm, I teach, and I do all these interesting things, but, and like, if you want to know the dynamics and how to put it in your contract, but what you have to do is fix your job and what the company is going to do for you. Because no company is going to be like, I'm going to hire you at $250,000 a year. No, wait, I'll give you a bonus, $400 grand a year. But you're on the hook if there's a breach for $9 million. Right? That's not how businesses operate. Nobody would actually functionally do the job. So you have to have that as a conversation. And you will likely, and if they say no, right? And I've worked with global corporations all over the world, right? And sometimes the chief security officer, they won't share the D&O policy. Right? Because for a range of reasons that probably aren't very functionally good from a personal perspective, but from the corporate perspective, it may make sense. But that's when then as a CISO, you need to make a decision, right? You need to go to them and say, hey, okay, well, can you hire me outside counsel and have them look at the cyber D&O policy and tell me if I'm covered? Right? But most corporations will agree to indemnify you. Most corporations will agree to pay for your defense. Now look, if you go out and commit a crime and rob a bank and say, I work for McDonald's, I'm robbing you on behalf of McDonald's. McDonald's isn't gonna be like, yeah, I'm gonna pay for your defense. That's not how the real world works. So as long as you're not committing some like nefarious criminal activity or part of the breach, right? They're going to pay for your defense. They're going to give you coverage, right? Because here's the other thing. Let's say you leave and 5 years later there's a hack. And the hack's on a machine that you installed on an IoT device that was installed, but because nobody actually knows how it works, let's be honest, they just let it run. And then somehow somebody connected to the internet and boom. Whereas my daughter at 12 says, boom, shagalaka. And everything breaks, okay? And then they say, then the plaintiff's lawyers, because people got injured, whatever else, they sue everybody, and they sue you personally as the CISO because you were the person that was responsible for securing that device at the time, right? You need to make sure that your employment agreement, your contract with the company for the job provides you a defense, that they will pay for it, right? And if they say, no, I'm not going to pay for your defense, do you really want to work there? It's like, yes, I want to work somewhere where I can be on the hook for $9 million 5 years later for something I didn't control because it's just such a great place, and this is where I want to go to prison because I don't love my family that much, right? So at a practical level, you have to start thinking about it like that, right? And I know it's a hard decision. I know it's tough to walk away from a job, but like, that's a decision. Like if you're a CFO and they're like, we won't insure you for SOX or for whatever else, and you know they're committing fraud, they go find another job, right? And I think cybersecurity insurance is a very effective tool for a company to manage risk, to manage supply chain risk, to manage business disruption. I mean, I could go through the litany of things, right? Social media, spear phishing, hacking, virtual, like there's a litany of things, right? You heard it today. And to give credit, right? I mean, it's not only about everybody will be hacked. And I agree wholeheartedly with the prior panel. How you respond is important. Testing it and making sure it works is even more important. But you know what really matters is making sure that you personally aren't going to pay the bill because you didn't have that, right? You don't want to personally be on the hook. So you need to have that conversation, and all employers will be fairly reasonable about it. But that's different than having a cybersecurity insurance policy for yourself. Because frankly, the $2 million you have, I mean, you can't afford me for like 2 months, 3 months. Good luck, goodbye. Like, I mean, that's just the facts of what defense would cost in a Tim Brown-like situation. Right? And I think you should go in with your eyes open and have those conversations. Companies aren't expecting senior executives to carry a $9 million risk. But they aren't expecting you to go in and be like, show it to me now, like a 2-year-old child. Right? You have to have a conversation where you educate and empower them so you can fix the problem. Right? But if you don't put that in place and you don't get a written contract, think of it like this. Company could hang you out to dry, save $5 million, or do what's right and stand by you. Okay, it's a risk. Maybe you got a great employer, maybe you have a crappy one. But you know what? I have now told you should go out and have the conversation with your employer. So at this point, you only have yourself to blame. Right? At a most practical level, you have to affirmatively do it. Right? Because one company's going to be like, yeah, I'm going to eat $9 million on a breach to pay for your defense. Now, yeah, sometimes it's way better to have a CISO in the tent. Right? Sometimes, think of it like this. Do you really want to have the guy who was responsible for securing shit and went to the board and said, you guys didn't do this, you guys suck, you guys failed, and they provide it all? Think of it like this. Do you really want them to be on the stand when the plaintiffs ask, so did you go? So there's a lot of ways you can answer a question when they ask you. So did you warn the board about breaches and incidents? Well, not only did I warn the board, I gave them a PowerPoint presentation and I informed them, and they just rolled their eyes at me in a horrible fashion and clearly had no respect for this. Or they can say, well, we engaged in a constructive dialogue and we came to a different perspective. Okay? So corporations and lawyers and risk people are all evaluating those risks. So yes, usually they'll pay for your defense even if it's not in the contract or whatever, but why take that risk? Why not have that conversation? And so I just encourage you all to understand the difference between cybersecurity insurance for the corporation doesn't secure you as a CISO. It secures the corporate entity from like loss of business, from killing, like I've dealt with cyber breaches where people have died, right? And there's policies like LPL, like general policies that cover those things, right? But they don't cover the chief security officer and their role in that capacity. And it's just really important that you recognize that difference and have the conversation. But have the conversation. Back to you, Samir.
Thank you. So in conclusion, begin to talk about risk differently with the board, right?
Yes. Boards don't, I sit in a lot of board meetings. So like if you talk to them about CVEs, they're going to think like, is that a type of ice cream? Like, I mean, like, I can't explain to you how important it is that you speak and know your audience and what they're focused on, right? They're focused on managing risk. Right? Big risks to the company. They don't care if you patched or didn't patch. They care if the patch resulted in a failure that resulted in the furnace lighting someone on fire and you had a human torch running around the metal factory. Yeah, then they're worried, right? So we have a few more minutes, so opening up to questions, and I recognize this is our last session as well. So any questions? Everybody has questions about cyber insurance.
I just want to comment that I made the right decision and I made sure I had that before I started.
Yeah, but even if
I have my own indemnification policy.
Yeah, your personal indemnification policy unfortunately won't pay for anybody's legal services in a real Tim Brown-like situation. Like you'll blow $7 to $10 million easily, and that won't trigger anything. So what you really want to do is go to your employer and talk to your employer and say, hey, look, does our insurance policy, and will you agree in my contract to indemnify me and put it in your employment contract with the right of enforcement and as long as they don't terminate you for like being a predator or something, right? But that's how you really want to approach it, because that personal liability coverage of $1 million, I mean, a good lawyer runs at $2,500 an hour. So just so you do the math on that, every 40 hours is 100 grand, right? And they're going to have a team of lawyers on it. So they'll blow $1 million in a month, right? So I just encourage you to adjust the employment contract itself, the letter, the retention letter, however you did it, and put it in writing.
So when you bill him $2,500, we're going to split that, right?
Oh yeah, of course, we'll share the money. Any other questions? I saw someone in the back which just couldn't help it. No, I'm kidding.
Other questions?
Well, it's a corporate decision, right? This is a board decision about how you manage risk, right? So, and different policies cover different actions, right? And depending on what kind of risk you're trying to manage, right? So some, like Chubb's policy, because I mediate some of the largest cyber coverage disputes in the world, okay? So it depends on what you're, like there was a $1.3 billion loss for Merck, okay? And they litigated that in New Jersey, went on appeal, and then they settled, okay? And that was under a general property insurance, not even the cyber insurance, and they settled. It wasn't a cyber policy. So you have to understand what you're buying, and you work with the insurance guy at your company, and you work together to understand it, right? And it manages the risk. That's the point.
Yeah, at the end of the day, think about helping the board and the executives defend themselves on a bad day, right? They have to govern risk. So what are the top 10 risks for your company? Is your cyber strategy aligned to that? Start with the basics.
We're all done. Time is up. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, everyone, for your time.